Good morning, y'all. I'm glad to get to be here with you. Even though it's just through video, it's nice to get to do something a little bit normal. I know that the sound quality is probably not up to my usual standards, but hey, laying in the hospital bed, getting to teach the Bible, I'm living the dream. I know a bunch of y'all have been praying for me, and I really appreciate that. And I ask that you continue to do so. Specifically, pray that the swelling in my knees will go down. Um, but enough about that. I'm just excited to get to go through, uh, continuing our study together. So let's pray, and then we will dive in. Father, I thank you for giving us your word, for giving us the opportunity to look and see what you've done so that we understand who you are, that what you've done for your people many years ago, that you will do for, you'll do for your people. And so, God, as we look at how you have grown your people, can I just ask that you just help us to see what you would have for us. In your name I pray. Amen. So we're in lesson 6, starting this next scene where we're talking about how God's people are growing. And so this is the third scene that we looked at. We've looked at how there was God's creation and a crisis, God's promise of a people. Now we're going to see what he's doing in the lives of those people. And so starting to look at this, let's just recap real quick. Scene 1, God's creation and crisis. Look heavily, Genesis 1 through 3, looking at what happened in creation, what happens with that specific creation of man and woman, and how when sin came into the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, it brought serious and lasting brokenness to people and to all God's creation. I've been thinking a lot about the effects of the fall just these last 2 weeks, dealing with this sudden illness that people are like, oh, do you think God's testing you? Do you think God's punishing you? I think, well, whatever it is God is doing is above my pay grade. And at least at this juncture, 1 second, y'all. Pause there for a second, because apparently the nature of this video is going to be people just walking in the room. So sorry about that inconvenience. Anyway, what I've been thinking of a lot this week is there's enough damage brought by the fall to humanity, to health, to so many things, consequences of the fall, far reaching, long from that bully with Adam and Eve, then it does a very good picture of of the brokenness we have because of sin and the effects it has on God's creation, right? Second scene, we spent a good bit of time in there. We took our time. We dove on to Genesis 4 through really almost all the way to 50, and talk about God's promise of the people, that God chose Abraham. And he made a promise that he would bless all the nations of the world through Abraham, right? And we see how God gave Abraham a child late in life, and then that child had a child, and then it really started branching out once you get to Jacob. And so looking at this, we get to see how God laid the foundation for these people at the very end there, with all of the things that happen with Joseph. We see God's people getting defeated, which is what begins what we're looking at today. And so starting on this specific lesson, we're going to end up covering much larger sections, not skipping over things. Remember, we're looking at this as a Bible overview, but we're going to be in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Again, not every single chapter, but we're following how closely, we're going to look closely and follow where God's promise to Abraham continued through these descendants. We start out here in Exodus when we get a Pharaoh who didn't know who Joseph was. We see the events begin to happen there. These are God's people who have a covenant promise from him through Father Abraham. And we're going to see how that plays out. We're going to see how those people grew. We're going to see how God began to shape them through the law, through their identity in him, and set them apart from other nations. Before we dive in, the main goal is to help us understand what happens in this part of the Bible story, in the chapter we start with and the ones that follow. So a few things to keep in mind. Number one, after Jacob and his family moved to Egypt during Joseph's life, they stayed there for like 400 years. What began as a small group of less than 100 people grew into an entire nation, all the Hebrews, which if you go back and look in the table of nations in um, Genesis 11, that goes to a man named He is where that comes from. It's not Hebrews coffee or tea. But was going to see when that small group of less than 100 people purging from an entire nation in the middle of the Egyptian nation, we began to feel afraid and threatened, which is understandable. We're going to look at heavily here at first the part called the Exodus story, which focuses mainly on Moses. Moses is the big deal. He's one of the great leaders in God's people, and lots of things in his life went on. Jamie looked at last week with the rock and the water. Lots of things that occurred in Moses' life point forward to Moses. In some ways, Moses would be what we call a type of Christ, somebody who, even though they were just a man, they're foreshadowing, they're pointing to Jesus. He, and similarly to not a Mosaic type of Christ, he's pointing you to him. He's not Christ. He's not fully like Christ, but we learn a lot about Jesus through learning about them. And he's going to help us see what Jesus would one day be like, even though Jesus is far greater. In this lesson, we're going to also look kind of generally. God gave his law to the people through Moses. We're not going over every detail of the law. And it's important, especially when we get into talking about the law, because there has been a temptation since the early part. You look at the book of Galatians, chapter 2, you look at Colossians, chapter 2, look at various things in Romans and in other New Testament epistles. People were trying to add the law to the gospel. Jesus fulfilled the law. The law showed God's righteous standard to his people, showed them how to best live in in their country, as a people, as how they interact with others. But here's the deal: they were never, ever, ever going to be able to follow. And to an extent, that's also, I'm not going to say it's kind of the point, but it was meant to show them how to live and show them the standard. But I don't know about y'all. When I look at the standard of righteousness, the standard of Jesus, I know I'm not going to get it. It shows me that I need him, and that I need to earn more. The more I try to learn, the wages of nothing, it's dead. And so this was, when we look at the law here, we're not given a list of things that you need to do. We're not learning stuff that you need to be checking off. We are looking specifically at how God showed his people how to best live, and it was never a way for them to earn eternal salvation. That is always, 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 think back to Abraham. Abraham trusted God, and it was counted toward him as righteousness. Salvation is always come through faith in him, then and on. And so we're going to be looking at the first few chapters of Exodus, see how God delivered his people from slavery through Moses, But it's important we realize this is all part of the singular story, God's one big Bible story of grace and salvation. This is the same God who created the world, same God who showed grace to Noah, same God who made promises to Abraham, and it's the same God who will now still work through Moses to save his people. And it's important for us to remember he's the same God we can know and follow today through faith in his son, Jesus Christ. Uh, I need to do better looking at these memory verses, but um, since these lessons end up taking so many weeks, this memory verse right here is one I would thoroughly, emphatically suggest that you memorize. And this is when God introduces himself to his people. He's talking to Moses there in Exodus 34, but he says he is the Lord, a God great, merciful, and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, who will by no means fear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. He doesn't introduce himself as the great lawgiver. He doesn't introduce himself as the great judge. He doesn't introduce himself as wrathful and powerful and firm to smite. He chooses to introduce to us, and we looked at this back in our little and lowly study. He chooses to introduce himself to his people, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. He's introducing them to his heart. I would strongly urge memorizing these two verses. With no further ado, and I won't go too far today because I know video and sound quality, it leaves something to be desired. But let's dive into this first section here, a new Pharaoh in Egypt. So remember, this is several hundred years after Joseph's story ends, which we looked at in the last lesson. Do you remember what Joseph told his brothers at the end of Genesis? Remember that big, almost paradoxical moment when he could have get sweet satisfying revenge, like you sold me into slavery, now I'm going to get you. Though he told them what they had meant for evil, God had meant for good. God used Joseph to bring his people to Egypt and save lives in Egypt, save the lives of the people that he was building. And through Joseph, God fulfilled that promise to Abraham, at least in part. In this Exodus starts, it becomes very clear that Egypt is not their promised land, so to speak. And we'll see that come up later. It really starts with an ominous note. Well, we're going to see very quickly that God is going to have to step in. He himself is going to have to step in and save. So let's look at Exodus 1. We'll take it a little bit of time. I'll try to pause if I think there's some spots we need to move into. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Pause right there. Think about the various times so far that we've seen in the Bible where God's people or people in general kind of balked at the idea of being fruitful and multiplying. Think about the Tower of Babel. Now they are fulfilling the creation mandate not to fill the earth, but to grow the people that God had promised Abraham. This is how they're getting to the number of offspring, like the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. All right, verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Jews. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal crudely with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they sent taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were dead, and were pause. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, I mean all kinds of work in the field. And all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and seat them on the birth stool, if it's a son, he shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, he shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. Pause, look at that. They are being oppressed. They have been not essentially, they have been enslaved by this Pharaoh, this king of Egypt. Well, he's telling them what to do. They feared God. The authority of the king did not override their fear. That's a powerful moment right there. These women were putting their own lives at risk. Let's start back at the beginning of 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, which let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? Let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them family. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, this first chapter of Exodus really sets the stage for everything that's going to happen next in the story of Moses and God's people. And so this is a big deal. This can help us follow and understand what's going on when the story unfolds. Let's look at three things here real quick. God's promise, God's people's problem, and God's blessing. So God's promise, first thing we see there in Exodus 1 is God kept that promise to Abraham. Verse 7, fruitful, increased greatly, filling the land of Egypt. Like I said, that's where we see that the beginning of these stars, these of descendants, like stars in the sun. And remember when God said that Abraham's wife is old, couldn't have children, she believed the promise. And then years later, promise is coming true. Families growing big, great nation right there in Egypt. Next, God's people's problem, looking there at verse 8, there's that big, important, and ominous verse. There arose a new king over Egypt. He did not know Jews. This is telling us things are about to change. For the Pharaoh who had put Joseph in charge of everything, Joseph was his golden goose. Joseph he went from slave to prisoner to like vice pharaoh, and everything he touched essentially turned to gold. Egypt amassed great wealth, great lands during that. But now we're beyond the memory of these. And so whatever favor they had, whatever trust they had, whatever influence they had is gone. It's over. And so now they just see this large group of people living in the middle of their country. And I want you to think about that. Like the way Pharaoh was going to handle this, all wrong, very evil, but it's an understandable fear. All of a sudden you turn around in the center of your country, you got, let's just say, spitball, and nobody knows the full number. At least at this point, a million folks, a nation growing in the middle of your nation. Be pretty doggone slow. Pharaoh decided, though, that he was going to use fear. He was going to use threat. He was going to use force, enslaved them, treat them terribly, great cruelty. And this is what we're going to eventually see is going to cause them to call out to God and say, well, we need your help. We need you to save us. And the cool thing is, we know for a fact that he hears them. Third thing, God's blessing. Even though they were suffering, two clear signs that God's blessing was still were. Number one, God's people kept ruling. The worse they treated them, look at verse 12, the worse they treated them, even in the Pharaoh's cruelty, they grew fortunately. No matter how hard Pharaoh tried, he could not stop what God had promised. Second, God blessed the Hebrew women who refused to kill the baby boys. They literally put their lives on the line. They feared God more than the king. They feared God more than the threat against their lives. This is a huge, huge, huge deal. And so if you'll look there, you got a few little discussion questions. Did you notice the especially ominous verse in the passage where we talked about there, verse 8? In what ways does it warn us something bad is coming for God's people? Which verses describe the way that God has richly kept his promises to Abraham? And then where in the passage do you see signs of God's blessing coming to people who were not part of Israel? How might this be a sign of what's to come later in the biblical story? All right, let's move on real quick and at least get started with Moses. We're going to call him a special sign. Exodus 2, we're going to see the first sign that God's answer is answering his people's cry against the suffering they're experiencing. Pharaoh has already started this all-out war against Israel, or we'll call them the Hebrews still at this point. And he's murdering baby boys. He's trying to get the midwives to believe. We're going to see really going to get some evil on here. But one of those baby boys who will, I genuinely believe, supernaturally protect from being murdered is going to grow up, be a prince of Egypt, and end up being a deliverer of Israel. And we're going to see how God's hand was on him in a very special way. Was preparing something for his people while they were still in the midst of slavery. Let's dive in Exodus 2. While a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman, the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, he hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, he took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. He took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Will I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse a child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. He named him Moses, because, he said, I drew him out of the water. This right here is just such a cool picture to me of something God did with us today. God had rescued the baby. The sister was there, and she got the witness. The mother was going to, Moses' mama was going to find out that he lived. And not only did he live, but he was going to be in a place and raised safer than all the rest of them. He wasn't going to grow up a slave. He wasn't going to grow up a priest. But God, in his grace and mercy and love, um, let Miriam, Moses' sister, go and get Moses' actual mama to nurse him. And so she got that little bit of time and safety to be with the boy. I don't know, that's beautiful. Look at verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man and the woman, what have you strike your companion? He answered, who made you attempts and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you kill the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. This passage right here is going to show you how God can use anybody. This doesn't excuse the 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 death that happened there. That several this wasn't. I don't think this would be something that necessarily qualifies it, it, excusable in any which way. I mean, you look at verse 12. He looked this way. He looked at it, saw nobody, felt it, hit him in the sand. This is straight up sin. This is not good. But this, now we see that all that he enjoyed in Pharaoh's palace is over. Moses is now cast, and even his own people know that he is a murderer. Look here at verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home and told their father Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon? They said, the Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, and where is he? Why have you left this man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of the slavery and cried out for him. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and they heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Well, let's read verses 23 through 25 again. Specifically, let's read. During those many days, the king of Egypt died. One second.